Welcome to the Edelheit Experience, a compelling conversation about revolutionizing health and well-being, bringing you rich stories and lessons learned from leading corporate executives. Now, we'd like to introduce your host, Jonathan Edelheit.
Welcome, everyone, to the Edelheit Experience. I'm really excited about today's guest, who is a true treasure, Julian Treasure. Julian, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And I have never heard that pun before.
I'm sure you haven't. So you are, I think, one of the most dynamic and well-known speakers when it comes to learning how to speak, learning how to listen, about sounds. How did you get into this? How did you get into the space to become like the world-renowned expert in this area?
Well, it's like most things in life, in my experience, one thing leads to another, really. I had a long career in marketing, started and grew a custom publishing company producing customer magazines in the UK. But all the way through that, I was having another life, really, as a musician. I've been a musician since I was quite small. I'm a drummer. I've heard all the jokes. I think my favorite one is, how do you know if the stage is level, the drummer is drooling out of both sides of his mouth? So drummers get a bad rap, but actually it's a really important role in a band. And like all musicians, if you're playing in a band, whatever you're playing really, you have to have a particular kind of listening. It's a multi-track listening. It's a very attentive listening. Because if you're not listening to all the other instruments at the same time, you're not going to play well. You're not going to be contributing to the kind of gestalt that is the whole band. So I learned that listening. And as I was dealing with big brands and looking at the way they were operating and just experiencing the world, it became more and more clear to me that the world didn't sound very good. And that a lot of the noise I was experiencing was being made by organizations who simply weren't thinking about it. So when I sold my magazine company back in 2002, I wanted to do something about sound. And the first question was, does it matter that all this noise is being made? And the research is very clear. Yes, it matters a lot. Noise is a killer, and it's killing millions a year. It's only just behind air pollution in the WHO's, the World Health Organization's list of serious health issues. And yet it's something that's never thought about, really. You know, you don't get many politicians saying, vote for me, I'll make it quieter. So it's a kind of hidden problem in the world, not just outdoor, where noise is depriving millions of sleep at night across America, across Europe, causing all sorts of health problems, causing costs to health services of billions and billions and billions as a result of people being deprived of sleep, having stress, having elevated blood pressure, heart conditions, accidents, and so forth. But it's also a problem indoors. I mean, we spend 93% of our lives indoors, and the sound inside is not great. So all of these things kind of occupied me a lot. And I started a company called the Sound Agency back in 2003, which was all about helping organizations to make good sound instead of bad sound. Part of that's in marketing. It's called audio branding. And that's asking the question, how does your brand sound? And many brands just focus on how they look. And there's a huge amount of evidence about the amount of research and money that goes into visual marketing. It's the vast bulk of it. And yet, a lot of our experiences with companies go through our ears. You think of phone call and the frustration that many people feel in that particular contact with a company, that touch point. So there's audio branding. And then there's also the sound organizations are making, generally the sound in their reception, the sound in their offices, the sound in showrooms, shops, all sorts of different places. So sound is absolutely critical. And I got the chance to stand on the TED stage back in 2007 for the first time and talk about sound. nobody had ever used sound in a TED talk. So I was lucky enough to be the first person to do that, and that went really well. And then I got the chance to do 4 more in successive years on the TED stage. And I've done, I think, 9 TEDx talks now as well.
And you count?
As they went through, say again?
I was going to say, have you counted how many views you've had, what you're up to now?
I honestly don't know, but if you add them all together, it's way over 100 million, which is pretty frightening. I'm not sure where it is now. I know that I was going to say the talks sort of moved from sound into personal sound, because it, really occurred to me along the way that it's not organizations that make sound, it's the people in them. So it's really about our personal responsibility for the sound that we're making, and of course the sound we're consuming. So my 3rd TED talk was about listening, and then there was one about designing spaces that actually work, schools, hospitals, offices, and so forth. And the 5th and final one was about speaking, called How to Speak So That People Want to Listen. And that's the one that went completely ballistic. I mean, I don't know how many tens of millions of views it's had. I think it's the 7th most viewed TED talk of all time. Amazing. And interestingly, that one has been seen by at least 5 times as many people as the one on listening, which says something, I think, about the priorities we have. So that's, I hope, an answer to your question, very long-winded answer, but it gets us to where we are now, I guess.
So do you think that, people are more selfish in that they want to figure out how people can listen to them, but they're not necessarily attuned to learning how to listen themselves?
I think there is an element of that, yes, Jonathan. I mean, you look at social media, which I unkindly call personal broadcasting. There's this kind of fantasy that we all have that there are thousands of people out there hanging on our every tweet or post or whatever it might be, and there really aren't. So yes, I think in general, as human beings, we're more concerned with being heard than with listening to other people. And that's a shame, because in all my work and at the core of everything I'm doing about personal communication, there's this model of a circle. It's not a straight line. I speak, you listen. It's a circle, because the way I speak affects the way you listen. The way you listen affects the way I speak, and so on and so on. So it's a dynamic process. And actually, if anybody listening to this wants to be a powerful speaker, the first thing to learn is how to listen.
If you rated which was more important, would it be listening or speaking so people can listen to you?
Well, first, I'd say listening. I think listening is the foundation. It's absolutely critical. It's very hard to be a good speaker if you don't listen. One of the distinctions that I make in my work is the realization that many people don't have, that you always speak into a listening, and that listening is unique. So we all have a unique listening, a way of listening, because we listen through a set of filters. And those filters are things that we gather along the way from being born into a culture, learning a language, and then perhaps values, attitudes, beliefs. And then in any given situation, intentions, expectations, emotions, there's a lot of different things. So your listening changes over the day, and every individual human being has a listening that's unique to them. And that means if you want to be received, you need to start listening to the listening, really. You need to start asking yourself the question, what's the listening I'm speaking into? So I think it's really critical to be conscious of listening in order to be able to speak powerfully. Shouting at people just doesn't really work. If you know what's motivating them, if you listen to them, then you'll know the right thing to say and the right way to say it.
Do you think it's easier, when you're older to be able to listen? Because I remember, when I started out in my career, I just talked. And I was really on the sales side, and I would just do what I would consider filibusters. And for me, and in the role I worked in, it worked, but I just wouldn't listen, And the older I get, the more sophisticated level that I feel like I'm at in the business world, I've realized, I need to shut up and I need to listen. But that didn't resonate to me when I'm younger. And I'm also curious is, why is listening such a hard skill to attain?
Well, first of all, most people don't even realize it's a skill. It's really often confused with hearing, and it's taken as a capability. Listening is not a capability, it's a skill. It's a skill that you can master, practice, and a skill which many people simply don't connect to at all. We don't teach it in schools at all. It's a scandal if a child leaves school unable to read or write. But many millions of children leave school every year having never been taught how to speak effectively, and even more so, how to listen. It's just not on the curriculum, which is bizarre to me because speaking and listening is the oldest form of communication. We've been doing this for probably 150,000 years, maybe even more, using complex language. Reading and writing, writing was only invented 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So it's relatively recent. For all that time before that, we communicated by speaking and listening. And of course, for a very long time, listening, which is your primary warning sense, was critical to survival. If you were sharing a cave with bears or tigers, you needed to know about that and be listening very carefully. So we've kind of lost our connection with the key elements of listening, how important and how critical it is to us as human beings, particularly since we spend so much of our time indoors now. So, we're not connected to the sounds of nature, wind, water, birds, and so forth in the way we were. Many people miss those things. And actually, the research shows that those things are very good for us. They're good for our well-being and our health in all sorts of ways. So, yes, I think we've lost contact with this amazing skill. It's not taught. Most people don't have a practice of improving their listening. And they don't realize that they're listening through this whole set of filters. Because the moment you become conscious of these things, and really consciousness is the key, as with anything, you shine the light of consciousness on something and you can start to change it. But if it's in the dark, if you're not conscious of it, nothing is going to change it. So you can change the filters the moment you become conscious that you have them. So these kind of realizations that your listening is unique, that everybody else's listening is unique, that you've got filters, that they've got filters, these are really powerful realizations.
How do you stop from reverting back? And what I mean by that is the skill of listening has, for me personally, it's gotten better over time. But even last year, I remember there was one business deal and it just sits in my mind where I just didn't listen. And I just went back to my old self. And it didn't go well. I lost the deal because didn't listen, didn't really ask questions. And I was more excited in presenting why there was such a great fit between the two organizations. And it was a complete turnoff for them. How do you stop yourself, even if you start working on that skill, from reverting back to yourself? Is there some kind of special thing you do to remind yourself before a speech or, before calls that you have? Any wisdom there? Or it's just the simple act of consciousness and realizing what you did and don't repeat it?
Well, consciousness is definitely at the heart of it. I'm a great believer in habit, and it's a question of building good habits, like the habit of asking, what's the listening, before you speak to somebody or you stand on a stage speaking to an audience. That's a really good habit to get into. And simply by asking yourself that question every time, you get more and more sensitive to it, and it becomes kind of second nature. In my book, How to Be Heard, in the TED talk about listening, and most of all in my course, which is 7.5 hours on these topics, there are lots of exercises. And with all these exercises, I mean, I'm no different from any human being. You know, we may be given an exercise that's wonderful for us, and we do it for a bit, and then it kind of falls into disrepair and gets a little bit overgrown with moss, and it's something we used to do. So with all the exercises, I recommend doing one at a time. They're mostly very simple, and doing them for a week or two, maybe a month, just rigorously building the habit and testing out, is this really helping me? If not, discard. If it is, great, and then try another one. So yes, I think a lot of it's about building good habits, the same as with nutrition, hydration, exercise, any of the things that are good for us. You know, we can get into bad habits, let them lapse. Well, the consequences over time, you know, we can get in that frog in a pan of water syndrome. You know, we don't really notice the fat or the blood changing or the health changing or our relationships degrading. But listening, that's such an easy thing to do if you're conscious, and being conscious is what it's all about. I mean, relationships, you know, I just mentioned one of the most important things. Listening promotes intimacy. It's absolutely crucial in relationship. What's the most common complaint in any relationship? He or she never listens to me. And listening is absolutely fundamental. And along with not getting into the bad habits, you know, I talk about some of the habits that really hurt listening, like looking good, for example. And if that's what you're all about, if you want people to be impressed, then you're not listening to them very much. And, you know, as you said, if you sell in that way, if anybody sells in that way, I'm just trying to knock your socks off and impress you, it probably isn't going to work. You know, I think if you talk to any great salesperson, they'll say the most important part of the sales conversation is the listening, because you have to understand, what does the person need? What's their pain? What's their problem? What can I solve for them? And if you don't know that, then you're probably missing the target altogether and certainly not hitting the bullseye. So asking questions, being interested, and making that connection, really fundamental. And of course, the other bad habit, apart from looking good, trying to impress people, which, you know, doesn't work on a stage either. If you walk on and it's all about me, people can tell. Actually, it's about what gift can I give to people. It's about the audience. But the other habit, which is probably even more seductive than looking good, that's being right. And we see so much of that in the world right now. Unfortunately, I think the internet has really propagated that and intensified it. So we don't go out looking for contrary opinions. We go out looking for validation. There you are. I knew I was right. Thousands of people agree with me. And then so you get silos, you get polarization, you get extremism. And we're seeing more and more of that in politics and in life, really, which is a great shame. And there's a great quote from the wonderful American author and counselor, the inventor of the amazing imago therapy method, a guy called Harville Hendricks. He said, you can either be right or be in a relationship. And you can't curl up with being right at the end of the day. So I think we need to watch out for the bad habits, and we need to work on good habits. And unfortunately, work is the word. You know, there's no substitute for it, just as with diet, as with exercise. Yep, it's work.
I like the comments you made regarding the relationship, because I think a pivotal part in my personal relationship was realizing I needed to listen to my wife, and with that, realizing that I would typically think I'm listening, but constantly give advice, feedback, solutions, when in reality, she would just wanted to be listened to.
Absolutely.
So how do you qualify that, like in helping people understand, you know, what's the difference between listening and trying to somewhat listen, but just give your opinion?
Well, I talk about listening positions or listening from. It's a good exercise, but it's also an important distinction to understand about the way you listen. And we tend to have a listening position that's relatively natural to us. And the metaphor here would be if there's a house on a hill, you can walk around the other side of the hill and see the other side of the house if you don't like the way it looks from here. But many of us have constructed a kind of concrete bunker at the base of the hill. And even, we're listening through a little slit in the front of it, which is our filters. And we've lost contact with the fact that there's a door in the back of the bunker we can walk out and go to somewhere else to listen from. By which I mean changing those filters, challenging values, attitudes, beliefs. Barack Obama said, "I will listen to you, especially if we disagree." Well, there's not many people who do that. We tend to listen much more easily to people we agree with, people that we feel we resonate with. We don't want to be challenged. And so listening from a different place is very important. And one of the listening positions, or the scales of listening positions I talk about a lot, is gender-based, actually, because there's a lot of research on this. Now, there are gender-based communication differences. So these are generalizations, obviously. So, they're slightly stereotypical, just putting that out there. But men, not all the time, but men tend to listen in a way I call reductive, which is exactly what you were just talking about. It's seeking solutions, looking for a point, going to a destination, and definitely solving things. That's a very male way of responding to a conversation. Women, on the other hand, not all women, not all the time, tend to listen in a way I call expansive, which is to say, it's not about a point. It's not about a destination. It's simply about being with the other person, and wherever it goes is wherever it goes. So you'll get a kind of mismatch there where perhaps she comes home and said, "Oh, I've had this awful day. This happened, this happened, this happened." He looks up from the football match and says, "Darling, have a bath. That always makes you feel better." And in the male world, that's problem solved, back to the football. Well, in the female world, that was not quite what she was looking for. What she was hoping for was something more along the lines of, "Oh no, sit down, have a glass of wine, tell me all about it." And that's a phrase which strikes terror into many male hearts. Tell me all about it. It's a sort of opening. It's not about solving a problem. It's about experiencing, sharing, being with the other person, and leaving them feeling heard, understood, and valued, which are the three things that we really want out of relationship. So becoming conscious of these listening positions, whether that resonates with anybody, it's really useful to ask yourself, where do I listen from? Is it critical? Is it empathic? Is it distracted? Is it focused? There are lots of places we can listen from. And if you become conscious of that, you're more able to move to another one and ask yourself the question, what's the most useful place I can listen from in this conversation to make it go well for the other person and to achieve the result I want to achieve, whatever that is?
I think it's a great place to really think when you're doing it, because I've done hundreds of keynote speeches and participated in panel sessions, and I always think about how do I bring value? But I think the way you position it, it's almost like, how do I bring a gift to everybody listening and make this a success and a win for them? I don't know, just to me, that really resonates. And I think I'm going to take that away and incorporate that into how I do my speeches going forward.
Wonderful.
If we shift over to the organizational side, we have a strategic partner of ours, Global Healthcare Accreditation, where they launch an accreditation for companies that validates their commitment to putting their employees first. And right now, with the last almost 2 years of the pandemic, one of the things that they're addressing is this, where employees just have a lack of trust and credibility in their companies, that they're prioritizing their health, their safety, their well-being. And a lot of employees also feel they're not being listened to. So, I know it's super important for companies to listen to their employees, and that's how they're going to make them more productive, make them less stressed, healthier, retain employees, attract new ones. How do companies listen to their employees, or are there better ways they should be doing it, especially knowing all the stress that we've gone through and the problems over the last 2 years?
Yes, it's a real issue. Actually, there was some research done a few years ago by a thing called the Organizational Listening Project. And fundamentally, what they found, and they assessed lots of organizations from small ones to very large ones. And what they found was that organizational listening is basically abject. It's terrible. 80%, and this is self-reported, so I bet these are exaggerations, 80% of the organizational effort, time, money, resources, energy, focus, went into outbound communication. Now, I don't think that's an overestimate. The overestimate, I think, is that they were saying 20% of their effort went into listening. Yeah, I doubt it. We all want to think we listen better and more than we really do, and I'm sure the organizations were no different. When you say corporate communication, immediately what you think of is advertising, PR, all this outbound. Very little of it's listening to what comes in from the outside. They might now have a small team of people on Twitter, maybe. But there's, if you try and feed back to most big organizations, you're into possibly a complaint handling process where you have to question, what's the intention here? Is it to make me go away and just shut up with some sort of, here's your free this, now please stop complaining? Or is it to take on board that I may have a valid point and take that into the organization so that we can improve the way we do things? Very rare you get that outcome. So where's the listening to the outside? And equally, where's the listening inside? I'll tell you a story about that. A long time ago, I was involved in an advertising agency, and this agency had a ferocious managing director. He was legendary for how he would basically bite people's heads off and shout at them, and everybody was terrified of him, especially if it was bad news. So what started to happen is that people wouldn't bring bad news to him, and then they moved on to hiding bad news or inventing good news. And the result of this was that over a period of years, the agency's accounts turned out to be nonsense, because people had been claiming they'd won business they hadn't won. They'd been claiming they hadn't lost business they had lost. It was a disaster. So not listening in that way, not being open to hear the good and the bad, can be disastrous in any organization. If you can't listen to countervailing opinions, if you can't listen to potential warning signs, there's a problem here, we're missing this, we're losing this. If you don't want to know about that, the whole thing can fall apart. So there is a huge task really involved in organizational listening, which has to come from the top. And it's not an email going around to everybody on a Monday morning saying, this week we've become a listening organization. Isn't that wonderful? Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. It takes a lot more effort than that. It does need listening from the top. It also needs all sorts of infrastructure. I mean, listening, interestingly, is one of the top skills that people recruit on. They ask, we want good listeners. It's asked in interviews and so forth. And then when somebody gets the job, suddenly it's forgotten about. Very rarely do you get 360-degree reviews, for example, where there's a question, how good is this person at listening for the people who work for them, for the people who work with them, for the people they work for? That question doesn't get asked very often. And even if it is asked, do people get rewarded for being great listeners? There was a great story that Hiram Smith told me. He was joint CEO of the Stephen Covey organization, the 7 Habits. And he told a story. They listened to a guy who was on their binder line who had an idea, and somebody listened to this guy. He was just, one of the functionaries on the line. He wasn't a manager or anything. They listened to him, and his idea saved them millions and millions of dollars in the coming years. So listening to ideas, if that's the gold dust, listening all the time to possible threats, to opportunities, and also listening to motivate people to understand what makes people tick and to make them feel involved in the organization. Critical. Listening is so important for organizations, and most of them are terrible at it.
I think it's a great point, because I think it's important to get contrary opinions. Within our organization, I always encourage people to speak up. I encourage people to tell me I'm wrong, that something I did was wrong, an idea I have is wrong. And I find, the most valuable feedback I get is when people say, tell me I'm wrong, or that if something should be done in a different way. I didn't always used to be that way. When I was younger, I would not listen at all. But I think that, as you said earlier, also in the podcast, it's, we've become a society that just wants to hear, our own opinions and views and be validated, versus hearing something different. When you're talking about the importance of listening, can that only be done verbally, or is this a skill that people need to learn and really upskill on when it comes to via email, for example, since we're doing so much communication via email? Can you listen? How do you listen when you're only dealing with people via email?
Yeah, I think written communication is a big issue because there's this kind of cloud of it surrounding us all the time. Hundreds. I mean, I don't know how many emails you get, but I get hundreds, and you can't read them all. And so you have to have some sort of triage system where you weed them out and so forth. But even after doing all that, you could spend your whole life. I mean, I honestly think a lot of people in the Western world could probably have a job description with just 2 words on it: answer email. And that's what they do all day. I mean, you can get into that, can't you? Because there's so much of it. So I think, yes, written communication can really become a fog that gets in the way of us being able to communicate with people in a more meaningful way. I'm a great fan of calling people. And there's sad research to show that, open plan offices were designed to foster communication and collaboration. They're terrible for concentration, of course, but that's another issue. But the research shows that even for the thing they're supposed to be good at, they're not working very well. The research shows that people are so bothered about being overheard, about the loss of speech privacy, that they would rather send emails to people who are sitting quite close to them than talk to them. So this kind of Wild West loss of privacy or privacy that we have in open plan is actually working against the very thing that the organizational space was supposed to be achieving. And so, yes, there's a lot of challenges. I certainly think, with CCing, for example, I mean, email is just propagating itself all the time. It's like a virus itself, isn't it? It's propagating everywhere, masses of CCs, and then everybody has to reply all, and you get all those huge chains of communication going around the place. Much simpler if we just phone the person that we're wanting to talk to. But yes, there are some rules also in designing communication and in receiving it. I mean, a very good rule about email, which I'm sure most of the people listening to this already have, is you do not have it on all the time with a little bing bong every time an email comes in. Fatal for your productivity. What you do is you have a time in the day where you do email, like an hour before lunch, an hour before you go home, whatever it might be. And that's your email time. The rest of the time, it doesn't exist, because otherwise you can't get anything done at all if it's going bing every 2 minutes and you're having to jump to respond to an email. And in composing it, there is a great habit that many, many people have with email, which is to do the sort of exposition first and get to the point at the bottom. So, this happened, dear so-and-so, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and therefore that happened. So I'm writing to you to ask you to do this. That is such a waste of people's time. You need to reverse the process. So the top of the email says, dear such and such, I'm writing to ask you to do this. Here are the reasons. Well, if the person doesn't want to or can't do that, they can discard the email immediately or just write back to you and say, I'm sorry, I don't do that, or I'm not going to do that, without wasting all the time reading all of the preamble or the explanation or the exposition of the thing. So I think there's a lot of bad habits with written communication, which of course, is really important. Books and writing have been seminal. They've allowed the propagation of amazing ideas and very much fostered the kind of growth of our civilization for whatever, for good or ill. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. We've been able to record things. We've been able to lock stuff down. If we hadn't had writing, we would nowhere near be where we are now. But on the other hand, it has to be used wisely and well. And that is not CCing 30 people on an email, which has got 10 paragraphs of stuff and then something at the bottom of it. So, yeah, I think written communication is, well, it's a difficulty. I wonder how many people listening to this sit in bed at 11 p.m. next to their partner doing email as opposed to having a conversation. That can be enormously addictive, that kind of thing. And of course, text and instant messaging and social media. We can get into these habits which are all about communing with text as opposed to speaking to people and listening to them.
I agree. Looking for that text or that email that's going to excite you or going to be good news versus actually engaging with the people right in front of you. That's a constant battle that I face every day. As we kind of come to the end of the podcast, a very important question that I also have is, your specialty is sound. I think that most companies don't focus on the sounds in the workplace and how that can affect people's productivity, their sense of well-being. Why is sound so important, and why should organizations be looking at this, or just people listening, saying, what should I be doing within my space that can be positively affect me?
Well, it is really important. Sound affects us physiologically, changes our body, our breathing, heart rate, hormone secretions, brainwaves even. It changes our feelings, our emotions and moods. It changes how well we can think. So cognition, there are massive effects in terms of noise getting in the way of being able to work. And it changes our behavior as well. So those four effects are always happening, even though we're not conscious of them most of the time. Noise is, as I said earlier, a real issue. It's a massive issue for well-being. And I'm not talking about necessarily deafening levels of sound. Many offices will be 60, 65 decibels, which is loud enough so you'd have to raise your voice to be heard. Well, long-term exposure, even to that level of noise, has been shown to raise your risk of heart attack. So it doesn't take deafening noise, which would obviously damage hearing. It doesn't take deafening noise to compromise our well-being in workspaces. And of course, there are so many other aspects to it. If you can't hear people that you want to hear, it's frustrating and you get errors. And there's lots of research showing, for example, in hospitals, noise, which is an absolutely catastrophic problem in hospitals. I mean, there's a survey by Johns Hopkins which showed that average noise levels in American hospitals are 12 times what they should be, which is disastrous for patient sleep. And sleep, of course, is how we heal. And also for things like prescribing errors, because if it's so noisy, you can't hear somebody, you make mistakes. Not to mention things like alarm fatigue, where there's beeping things going off all the time because somebody unplugged something when they moved a patient, and this thing is saying, this patient's dead, but there's nobody there, and it just goes on. So they get immune to these kind of things. But patients don't. And how anybody gets well in that environment with hissing, beeping and buzzing and alarms going off is amazing. So noise is a really big issue. And simply in open plan offices, noise is the number one complaint. There's countless surveys now which show that noise is the thing that really upsets people more than anything else. Lack of privacy on the one hand. So you can have an office that's too quiet. And if it's pin quiet and I take a phone call from my mum, that's mortifying, isn't it? I mean, everybody's listening to me. And at the same time, I am putting off everybody who's trying to work. So you need some masking sound to reduce the impact of unwanted conversation. But at the same time, you have to be balancing that. You don't want it too noisy, otherwise you're into those bad health effects. So there's something around 45 to 55 decibels. And the best kind of masking sound, it's now becoming clear, is biophilic, which is to say the sounds of nature. Water, for example, is very good at masking conversation because it masks particularly sibilants, consonants, which is how we really detect what's going on in a conversation. The vowels, not so much. You know, you've seen that exercise where you take the vowels out of a sentence and you can read it. Take the consonants out of a sentence and you have no idea what it's about. So sound can help to mask unwanted conversation. Water can do that, and wind to a degree. And at the same time, it connects people again with nature, which is something that's so missing and I think has got major health effects because, you know, the sounds of wind, water and birds have been around far longer than we have on this planet. And I think divorcing ourselves from nature in that way has an effect on us. So you get well-being effects and you also get productivity effects by designing sound in spaces that's appropriate for what needs to go on there. Starts with acoustics. You have to think about the acoustics of a room, remove unpleasant noises, have a decent sound system, and then put the right sound in for what is needed.
I think it's very important. I think there's an opportunity as also companies bring people back to work or reimagine the workplace, whether it's remote or hybrid, how they can incorporate this and they don't have to do things how they've always done them.
Definitely. We have to improve the quality of the workspace to entice people back. I mean, some people are desperate to get back. Depends on how nice your home is, doesn't it? You know, if you're not very happy at home, then you want to get back to the office because you can be more productive there. On the other hand, if you live in a nice place and you can really focus, there's a lot of people who are not keen on that 2-hour commute to go and do something they can do perfectly well at home, which is solo concentrated working. So the office of the future very much is about activity-based working. It's about more about meetings than it is about solo working. And it needs to have a real emphasis on quality and well-being, on technology, because it's hybrid and we will need to connect and do cloud-based working and so forth. All of these things, fundamental, lots of biophilia. I mean, that's becoming a big trend in architecture now, bringing the outdoors indoors. So we'll see all of these things. And the tech will be largely voice activated as well, or gesture activated. We're seeing that in homes now with smart speakers all over the place. So we're getting used to that kind of interface. And that's going to become a big part of our life, of course, which, you know, for me is quite interesting because, you know, this is using voice, reclaiming really the primacy of voice and listening in some sense with our relationship with technology.
I completely agree. So I want to thank you, Julian, for joining us on the Edelheit experience. This is very valuable, and I hope our listeners were listening and understand how they need to really focus on these things, whether it's speaking, listening, sound, as this is a skill that you have to work on and not just something you can check a box and be done with it.
Definitely. Well, it's been a pleasure, Jonathan. And of course, you know, if they want to find out more about sound in spaces, then moodsonic.com is our website, and it's about this generative biophilic sound. Or I'd be delighted to see people at juliantreasure.com about speaking and listening, or at thesoundagency.com about organizational sound. That's
great. You've been a keynote speaker at our conference before. I definitely would recommend people go through your course and really check out those 3 different websites, because I think they're all unique in what you can learn in those different services you provide. So thank you very much, Julian.
Thank you, Jonathan.